The snow was falling heavy on Memphis that December morning in 1976 when Elvis Presley made a decision that would haunt and heal him for the rest of his life. But this wasn't the Elvis the world knew. No sequined jumpsuits, no screaming fans, no entourage of yes-men following his every move. Instead, the king of rock and roll sat alone in a beat-up Ford pickup truck he'd borrowed from one of his groundskeepers, wearing a faded work jacket and a knit cap pulled low over his famous face. He was parked across the street from the Memphis Children's Home, and he'd been sitting there for over an hour, just watching the kids play in the courtyard through the chain-link fence, watching the way they moved, the way they stayed close to the buildings, the way they seemed to make themselves smaller, invisible. And with every passing minute, Elvis felt something breaking apart inside his chest. See, this wasn't some publicity stunt or charitable photo opportunity that his manager Colonel Parker had cooked up. This was personal. This was about a terrified 8-year-old boy named Elvis Aaron Presley who had once stood at the edge of losing everything, including his freedom. Most people don't know this story, but when Elvis was just a kid, his daddy Vernon got arrested for forgery, changed the amount on a check from $4 to $14, trying to put food on the table for his family. It was a desperate move by a desperate man, but the law didn't care about desperation. Vernon was sentenced to 3 years in Parchman Penitentiary, Mississippi's most notorious prison farm. And suddenly, little Elvis and his mama Gladys were left with nothing. No money, no support, and no way to survive. The authorities started sniffing around, asking questions about whether Gladys could properly care for her son alone. There were whispers in the community, people saying maybe it would be better if Elvis went to the state children's home until his daddy got out. Elvis never forgot the terror he felt during those months. The way his mama would cry when she thought he wasn't looking. The way she'd hold him too tight at night, like someone might come and take him away while they slept. He remembered lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what it would be like to live with strangers, to sleep in a room full of other kids who didn't have families either. By some miracle, they managed to stay together. Gladys took in sewing, cleaned houses, did whatever she could to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. But that fear, that knowledge of how close he'd come to being one of those forgotten children, never left Elvis. Even after he became the most famous man in the world, even after the money started rolling in and the crowds started screaming his name, he could still feel that 8-year-old boy inside him, scared and alone. And now, sitting in that borrowed truck outside the Memphis Children's Home, that little boy was screaming. Elvis had been thinking about this place for months. He'd drive by sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, just looking at those windows lit up yellow against the darkness, wondering about the kids inside, wondering if they felt the way he used to feel, wondering if anyone in the world cared whether they existed or not. The thing is, Elvis had everything now. Graceland, cars, jewelry, more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. But success had brought its own kind of loneliness. He was surrounded by people all the time, but most of them wanted something from him. His music, his money, his fame. Very few people just wanted Elvis, the man who still remembered what it felt like to be powerless and afraid. That's why he was here today, dressed like a maintenance worker, with no cameras, no reporters, no one to witness what he was about to do. This wasn't about his image or his legacy. This was about that scared little boy inside him who needed to do something, anything, to help kids who were living the nightmare he'd barely escaped. Elvis took a deep breath, checked his reflection in the rearview mirror one more time, and stepped out of the truck. The snow crunched under his work boots as he walked across the street, and with each step, his heart pounded harder. He wasn't nervous about being recognized. The disguise was good, and besides, who would expect Elvis Presley to show up at an orphanage dressed like a janitor? No, he was nervous about what he was going to find inside. Nervous about whether he'd have the strength to face these kids and not completely fall apart. The Memphis Children's Home was a red brick building that had seen better days. Paint peeling around the windows, concrete steps worn smooth by decades of small feet running up and down them. It looked exactly like the kind of place 8-year-old Elvis had nightmares about ending up in. He approached the front desk, where a tired-looking woman in her 50s was sorting through paperwork. She glanced up when he entered, taking in his work clothes and clipboard he'd brought as a prop. "Morning, ma'am," Elvis said, keeping his voice lower than usual and letting his natural southern drawl carry him. "I'm here about the heating system. Got a call about some units not working properly." The woman, whose name tag read Mrs. Patterson, barely looked up. "Oh, thank goodness. The kids have been complaining about the cold all week. I'll get someone to show you around." And just like that, Elvis Presley disappeared. He became just another working man, invisible in the way that people who fix things often are. Nobody looked too closely at his face. Nobody wondered why he seemed nervous. He was just there to do a job, and in a place like this, where resources were stretched thin and staff was overworked, an extra pair of hands was always welcome. But as Mrs. Patterson led him down the hallway, past bulletin boards covered with children's drawings and achievement certificates, Elvis felt that 8-year-old boy inside him starting to panic. The smell of industrial cleaning supplies mixed with cafeteria food, the sound of children's voices echoing off linoleum floors, the institutional lighting that made everything look sad and tired. This was it. This was the place he could have ended up. This was the life he could have lived. And somewhere in these halls were kids who were living it right now. Elvis gripped his clipboard tighter and followed Mrs. Patterson deeper into the building, not knowing that what he was about to discover would shatter his heart in ways he never expected and change the lives of dozens of children in ways they would never know. The mission had begun. As Mrs. Patterson led Elvis through the corridors of the Memphis Children's Home, he tried to keep his breathing steady, tried to maintain the persona of just another maintenance worker doing his job. But with every step deeper into the building, the walls seemed to close in around him. The institutional green paint, the scuffed linoleum floors, the smell of disinfectant that couldn't quite cover up the underlying sadness of the place. It was all too familiar, too close to the nightmares he'd carried since childhood. "The heating units are mostly in the common areas," Mrs. Patterson was saying, her voice echoing off the walls. "The children's dormitories, the recreation room, the dining hall. We've been having trouble keeping the temperature consistent, and with Christmas coming up, well, we're trying to make things as comfortable as possible for the little ones." Christmas, the word hit Elvis like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on getting inside, on maintaining his disguise, that he hadn't really thought about the timing. It was December 18th, just 1 week before Christmas, 1 week before the holiday that was supposed to be magical for children everywhere. As they turned a corner, Elvis heard the sound that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Children's voices, but not the joyful, excited chatter you'd expect to hear a week before Christmas. These voices were different, quieter, more controlled, like they'd learned not to expect too much, not to get their hopes up too high. Mrs. Patterson opened a door marked Recreation Room, and Elvis's heart nearly stopped. There were about 20 children inside, ranging in age from what looked like 5 or 6 up to maybe 15. They were sitting around folding tables, working on what appeared to be Christmas decorations. Paper snowflakes, construction paper angels, chains made from old magazines. But there was something heartbreaking about the scene that Elvis couldn't quite put his finger on at first. Then he realized what it was. The decorations were beautiful, carefully made, with the attention to detail that children put into things when they really, truly care. But they were all made from scraps, leftover paper, used magazines, bits of ribbon that had clearly been saved from other projects. These kids were trying to create Christmas magic out of whatever they could find. "The children have been working very hard on decorations for the holiday," Mrs. Patterson said, and Elvis could hear the forced cheerfulness in her voice. "They're so creative, making something beautiful out of nothing." Elvis nodded, not trusting his voice. He pretended to examine a heating vent while he watched the children work. That's when he saw her. She was sitting at a table near the window, a little girl with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a dress that was clean but clearly had been mended multiple times. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, the same age Elvis had been when he almost ended up in a place just like this. She was carefully cutting out paper stars, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration, completely absorbed in her work. Something about her reminded him so powerfully of himself as a child that he had to steady himself against the wall. Maybe it was the way she held herself, like she was trying to be invisible. Maybe it was the careful way she handled the materials, like she knew they were precious and couldn't be wasted. Or maybe it was just something in her eyes, that look of someone who had learned too young that the world wasn't always kind to little girls and boys who didn't have anyone to protect them. "That's Sarah," Mrs. Patterson said, noticing where his attention had gone. "She's been with us for about 2 years now. Sweet child, very quiet. She's one of our best helpers with the younger children." Elvis watched as Sarah finished cutting out a star and held it up to the light, examining it with the critical eye of an artist. Then she carefully set it aside and reached for another piece of paper. That's when Elvis noticed something that made his chest tighten with emotion. She was rationing the paper. This little 8-year-old girl was carefully counting out how many stars she could make with the materials she had, making sure there would be enough for everyone else at the table. She would cut out one star, then pause, looking at the remaining paper, calculating whether she could afford to make another one. Sarah called out one of the older boys from across the room. "Miss Patricia wants to know if you're gonna help with the Christmas list tonight." Sarah looked up from her work, and Elvis saw her face clearly for the first time. She had large, expressive eyes that seemed too old for her young face, and when she smiled at the older boy, it was the kind of smile that was trying very hard to be brave. "I don't think so, Tommy," she said quietly. "I'm not gonna ask Santa for anything this year." The older boy, Tommy, walked over to her table. He looked like he might be 14 or 15, with the kind of protective attitude that older kids in places like this often developed toward the younger ones. "Come on, Sarah," he said gently. "You gotta at least try. Maybe this year will be different." Sarah shook her head, going back to her paper cutting. "Santa only comes to kids who have families, Tommy. You know that. He doesn't come to places like this." Elvis felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart with an iron fist. He had to turn away, pretending to check another heating vent, because he was afraid he might start crying right there in front of everyone. Mrs. Patterson had moved on to talk to some of the other children, but Elvis stayed close enough to hear more of Sarah and Tommy's conversation. "That's not true," Tommy was insisting, but Elvis could hear the doubt in his voice. "My sister got a present last year. Remember that doll someone brought?" "That wasn't from Santa," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "That was from the church ladies. They brought toys for everyone, but they weren't Christmas presents, not real ones." "What's the difference?" Sarah looked up at Tommy with those two old eyes. "Real Christmas presents come from people who love you, people who know what you want, not just what you need. Santa brings those to kids who have mommies and daddies. We just get charity." Elvis had to step out into the hallway. He couldn't listen to any more without completely breaking down. This little girl, this baby who should have been writing letters to Santa and believing in magic and waking up excited about Christmas morning, had already figured out that she was forgotten, that she was invisible, that whatever joy the holiday brought to other children, it wasn't meant for her. He leaned against the wall in the empty corridor and took deep, shaking breaths. This was exactly what he had been afraid he would find, and it was somehow even worse than he had imagined. These weren't just kids without parents, these were kids who had learned not to hope. Kids who had figured out that they lived in a different world from the children they saw on television or heard about in stories. When Mrs. Patterson found him a few minutes later, Elvis had managed to compose himself enough to continue the charade. "Sorry," he said, "had to check my notes about the heating specifications." She nodded absently. "Would you like to see the dormitories next? That's where the children have been having the most trouble with the cold." As they walked toward the dormitories, Elvis couldn't stop thinking about what Sarah had said. Santa only comes to kids who have families. The idea that these children had convinced themselves they weren't worthy of Christmas magic, that they had learned to expect nothing and be grateful for whatever scraps of charity came their way, it was destroying him. He thought about his own childhood Christmases, even the lean ones when his family had almost nothing. His mama had always found a way to make Christmas special, even if it was just a single small gift or a special meal she'd saved up to make. He'd never doubted that Santa knew where he lived, never questioned whether he deserved the magic of the season. But these kids had learned that lesson too early and too well. They had learned that some children matter and some children don't. Some children get Christmas morning and some children get charity. Some children get to believe in magic and some children learn to be grateful for whatever they get. As Elvis followed Mrs. Patterson deeper into the building, past dormitory rooms filled with narrow beds and small dressers that held all of these children's worldly possessions, he felt something hardening in his chest. Not anger, exactly, but determination. A resolution that was forming itself into a plan. These children thought Santa didn't know where they lived. They thought they had been forgotten by the magic of Christmas. They thought they lived in a world where hope was just something that happened to other people. They were about to learn how wrong they were. But first, Elvis had to figure out how to give them Christmas without taking away their dignity, how to bring them magic without making it feel like charity, how to let them know they were loved without revealing who was doing the loving. Because the most heartbreaking thing of all was that they deserved so much more than they believed they were worth. Elvis spent the rest of that day pretending to fix heating units while his mind raced with possibilities. Every conversation he overheard, every glimpse into these children's lives, only reinforced what he'd learned from Sarah. These kids had given up on Christmas magic. They'd accepted that they lived in a world where miracles happened to other people's children. But Elvis Presley had built his entire career on believing that impossible dreams could come true, and he was about to prove it to 23 forgotten children. As evening approached and Mrs. Patterson prepared to show him out, Elvis made his move. He waited until they were alone in her office, then quietly closed the door behind them. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice still disguised but carrying a new weight of authority, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise me you'll keep it between us." She looked up from her paperwork, confused. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" Elvis took a deep breath, then slowly removed his knit cap. Even with his hair disheveled and his face tired from the emotional weight of the day, there was no mistaking who he was. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes went wide, and for a moment, Elvis thought she might faint. "Mr. Presley," she whispered, "oh my God, you've been here all day. The children, they had no idea." "And they can never know," Elvis said firmly. "That's the most important thing, Mrs. Patterson. They can never know it was me. Do you understand?" She nodded slowly, still in shock. "But why? I mean, why the disguise? Why not just, people do charity visits all the time. The publicity would be." "This isn't about publicity," Elvis interrupted. "This is about dignity. These kids, they've already figured out the difference between charity and Christmas magic. If they knew Elvis Presley came here and gave them things, it would just be another celebrity charity event. They'd be grateful, sure, but they'd still know they were recipients of pity." Mrs. Patterson was beginning to understand, but Elvis could see she was still confused about what exactly he was proposing. "I want to give these children Christmas," Elvis continued. "Real Christmas. The kind where they wake up Christmas morning and believe, just for a moment, that maybe they weren't forgotten after all, that maybe they do live in a world where miracles can happen." "How?" she asked simply. Elvis had been thinking about this all day, and now the plan was crystallizing in his mind. "I heard Sarah say that Santa only comes to kids with families, so we're going to prove her wrong, but not as Elvis Presley, as Santa." Over the next hour, Elvis laid out his plan to Mrs. Patterson, and with each detail, her amazement grew. This wasn't just about buying some toys and dropping them off. This was about creating an experience that would restore these children's faith in magic. "First," Elvis said, "I need you to make a list, not just names and ages, but everything. What each child wants more than anything in the world. Their favorite colors, their dreams, the things they whisper about when they think no one is listening. I want to know if Tommy wants to be a baseball player and what Sarah draws in her spare time, and whether little Michael still cries for his mama at night. Mrs. Patterson was scribbling notes furiously. That's a lot of information to gather without making them suspicious. You're going to tell them the truth, Elvis said. Sort of. You're going to say that you heard from some people who know Santa, and that maybe, just maybe, if they made Christmas lists this year, something special might happen. But you're going to emphasize that there are no guarantees. You don't want to get their hopes up too high. And then I'm going to make sure every single thing on every single list shows up Christmas morning. Not cheap substitutes, not close enough versions. Exactly what they asked for. If Sarah wants a specific baby doll she saw in a store window, that's the doll she gets. If Tommy wants a baseball glove like the one his hero uses, that's the glove that appears under the tree. But Elvis was just getting started. The toys were only the beginning of his plan. I also want to set up college funds for every child in this place, he continued. Anonymous trust funds that will pay for their education when they're old enough. They'll never know where the money came from, just that when the time comes, someone believed they were worth investing in. Mrs. Patterson's pen had stopped moving. She was staring at him with tears in her eyes. Mr. Presley, do you have any idea what you're talking about? The cost of something like that? I know exactly what I'm talking about, Elvis said quietly. I know what it's like to be 8 years old and scared that nobody cares whether you exist or not. I know what it's like to feel forgotten. And I know what it would have meant to that little boy if someone had shown up and proved that he mattered. There was more to the plan, so much more. Elvis wanted to arrange for each child to receive a personal letter, supposedly from Santa, that showed he knew specific things about their lives, their struggles, their dreams. He wanted to make sure there were special Christmas treats, a feast that would make these institutional meals feel like a celebration. He wanted Christmas morning to feel like stepping into a fairy tale. But here's the most important part, Elvis said, leaning forward with intensity. The story can never be that Elvis Presley did this. The story has to be that Santa Claus is real and that he doesn't forget children just because they don't have families. These kids need to believe that they live in a world where magic is possible, where someone out there loves them, even if they don't know who. Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes with a tissue. How do we explain it? I mean, this kind of Christmas miracle, people are going to ask questions. Elvis had thought about this too. You tell them the truth. You tell them that a few weeks before Christmas, you got a phone call from someone who said they'd heard about the children here, someone who wanted to make sure they had a real Christmas. You never got a name, just a promise that if the children made lists, those lists would be taken care of. And Christmas morning, everything appeared like magic. What about the media, if word gets out about something this elaborate? The media can report on a Christmas miracle at the Memphis Children's Home all they want, Elvis said. Let them speculate about anonymous donors and mysterious benefactors. The more mysterious it seems, the more magical it becomes for the children. They need to believe in magic, Mrs. Patterson. They need to know that sometimes wonderful things happen for no reason except that they deserve them. As Elvis prepared to leave that night, he made one more request that nearly broke Mrs. Patterson's heart all over again. I want you to put together a Christmas morning for me too, he said quietly. I want to be able to watch them, not as Elvis Presley, not as the person who made it happen, but just as someone who gets to witness magic. Can you arrange for me to be here, maybe as a volunteer or another maintenance worker? I need to see their faces when they realize that Santa didn't forget them. Mrs. Patterson promised she would handle everything, and as Elvis walked back to his borrowed truck in the snow, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Not the shallow satisfaction of another successful concert or another hit record, but the deep, soul-filling purpose of knowing he was about to change lives in ways that would ripple forward for generations. The plan was audacious, expensive, and completely impossible to explain to anyone who didn't understand what it felt like to be a forgotten child. But Elvis didn't care about audacious or expensive. He cared about 23 children who had learned not to believe in miracles, and he was about to prove them wrong in the most beautiful way possible. Christmas morning was 6 days away. 6 days to create magic. 6 days to restore faith. 6 days to show some very special children that they lived in a world where love could appear out of nowhere, where hope was always justified, and where Santa Claus was absolutely real. The most heartbreaking part of Elvis's plan wasn't how much it would cost or how elaborate it would be. The most heartbreaking part was that these children would never know who loved them enough to give them back their childhood dreams. They would just know that someone, somewhere, thought they were worth believing in. And sometimes, that's the purest kind of love there is. Christmas morning, 1976, dawned cold and clear in Memphis. Elvis arrived at the children's home at sunrise, once again disguised as a maintenance worker, carrying a toolbox that contained nothing but tissues and a camera he would never use. Mrs. Patterson had arranged for him to be there under the pretense of checking the heating system one more time, making sure everything was working perfectly for the holiday. What Elvis witnessed that morning would haunt him in the most beautiful way for the rest of his life. The children came downstairs in their pajamas and robes, expecting the usual Christmas morning routine, maybe some small gifts from local churches, a special breakfast if they were lucky, and the quiet disappointment that came with another holiday that proved they were forgotten by the world. Instead, they found magic. The recreation room had been transformed overnight. A massive Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with lights and ornaments that sparkled like jewels. Beneath it were piles of wrapped presents, each one bearing a child's name in beautiful handwriting. The room smelled like Christmas cookies and hot chocolate, and Christmas music played softly from a radio that hadn't been there the day before. Elvis watched from the doorway as the children stood frozen, afraid to believe what they were seeing. It was little Sarah who broke the spell. She approached the tree slowly, as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly, and found a package with her name on it. When she opened it, her gasp echoed through the silent room. Inside was the baby doll she had mentioned to Mrs. Patterson just once, weeks earlier, a beautiful doll with dark hair like hers, wearing a dress that Sarah had admired in a store window but never dared to ask for. But that wasn't all. There was also a set of art supplies, the kind that real artists used, with a note that said, "For Sarah, who makes the world more beautiful with her drawings. Love, Santa." One by one, the other children began opening their presents, and Elvis watched as their faces transformed from disbelief to wonder to pure, overwhelming joy. Tommy got the baseball glove he'd dreamed about, along with a letter from Santa saying he'd been watching Tommy take care of the younger children and was proud of his leadership. Little Michael, who still cried for his mother at night, received a teddy bear that looked remarkably like the one he'd lost when he came to the home, along with a recording of lullabies and a note saying his mama was watching over him from heaven. But it was what happened next that broke Elvis completely. Sarah stood up in the middle of the chaos of wrapping paper and excited children, tears streaming down her face, and said in a voice that carried across the room, "I was wrong. I was wrong about Santa. He does come to kids like us. He does know where we live." Elvis had to step outside. He stood in the cold morning air, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, knowing that he had just witnessed something that would sustain him through every difficult moment for the rest of his life. The magic of that Christmas morning was just the beginning. Over the following months, Elvis continued his secret support of the Memphis Children's Home. New programs appeared as if by magic: music lessons, art classes, field trips to places these children had never dreamed of visiting. College funds were quietly established, waiting for the day when each child would be old enough to pursue their dreams. Sarah never forgot that Christmas morning. She kept that baby doll throughout her childhood, and when she grew up, she donated it to another little girl who needed to believe in magic. The art supplies Elvis had given her led to a scholarship to art school and eventually to a career as a children's book illustrator. She spent her life creating the kind of magical stories she had learned to believe in that Christmas morning. Her most famous book, published decades later, was called The Christmas Someone Remembered, and it told the story of children who thought they were forgotten until magic proved them wrong. She never knew that the man who had given her that gift was sitting in the audience the night she won a national award for that book, crying as she dedicated it to the mysterious angel who taught me that love can come from strangers and miracles happen to children who need them most. Tommy became a social worker, dedicating his life to children in foster care and group homes. He would often tell the kids he worked with about the Christmas when Santa proved that no child is ever truly forgotten, and he would make sure that each of them experienced their own version of magic during the holidays. Little Michael grew up to become a pediatric nurse, specializing in children who were alone in the hospital during holidays. He would bring them the teddy bears that looked remarkably like the one he'd received that Christmas morning, along with the same message of love and hope that had sustained him through his darkest nights. The other children from that Christmas morning all carried the memory forward in their own ways. They became teachers who paid special attention to the quiet, forgotten kids in their classrooms. They became parents who adopted children from the system. They became people who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show someone that they matter to the world. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this story is what Elvis carried with him from that day forward. He never sought recognition for what he'd done. He never told anyone, not even his closest friends, about his secret visits to the children's home. The only record of his involvement was found years after his death, when his accountant discovered a series of anonymous payments that had been made to the Memphis Children's Home and dozens of other orphanages and children's facilities across the country. The last check Elvis Presley ever wrote was dated August 14, 1977, just 2 days before he died. It was made out to the Memphis Children's Home, with a note in his handwriting that said, "For the Christmas fund, so no child ever has to stop believing in magic, from someone who understands what it feels like to be alone." Mrs. Patterson, who had kept Elvis's secret for over 40 years, finally revealed the truth in 2018, when she was in her 90s and felt the story needed to be told. She had kept every letter Elvis had written to accompany the children's gifts, every note about their progress, every photograph of Christmas mornings he had helped create. "He didn't just give those children presents," she said in her only interview about the story. "He gave them back their childhood. He gave them back their faith in magic. He showed them that they lived in a world where miracles were possible, where love could come from unexpected places, where someone somewhere thought they were worth believing in." The legacy of that secret Christmas morning lives on in ways Elvis never could have imagined. Sarah's books have touched millions of children. Tommy's work in social services has transformed countless lives. Michael's gentle care in hospital wards has brought comfort to families in their darkest hours. And every Christmas, at children's homes across the country, there are still mysterious deliveries of perfectly chosen gifts, accompanied by notes signed only with "From someone who believes you deserve magic." Some people say it's copycat philanthropy, inspired by the story of Elvis's secret Christmas. Others believe it's the continuation of something Elvis started, a network of people who understand that the most powerful gift you can give a child is the knowledge that they are not forgotten. The truth is probably both. Elvis Presley showed the world that the greatest act of love is sometimes the one that nobody knows you performed. He proved that real magic doesn't need an audience, that genuine kindness doesn't require recognition, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help a child believe that miracles are possible. The children from that Christmas morning in 1976 never knew that the king of rock and roll had been their secret Santa, but they knew that someone, somewhere, had loved them enough to give them back their dreams. And in the end, that's all that mattered. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to remember that kindness can come from unexpected places. What acts of secret generosity have you witnessed? Share your stories in the comments below. You never know who needs to hear them.